Hello and welcome to our fourth hypothetical webinar, Insurance Implications of an Automated Vehicle Future. My name is Jerome Karslake and I'm co-chair of the Australian and New Zealand Drivers Vehicle Initiative Policy and Risk Group and manage the National Road Safety Partnership Program as well. So I'm here to facilitate today's webinar and hopefully that's our only technological glitch we have. So for those of you unaware of what ADVI is, sorry, that is me. And for those of you unaware of what ADVI is, ADVI's goal and vision is to accelerate the safe and successful introduction of driverless vehicles onto Australian and New Zealand roads. So we have a very exciting panel session today. We have 4 expert panelists joining us, and of course you, the audience. As we've always done, ADVI has created some guiding questions and scenarios for our panelists to explore, but most particularly, we really want to hear from our audience, the burning questions from you that can really challenge and push the limits to our panelists. So, who are our panelists we have today? We have Tom Lunn, Senior Policy Advisor at the Insurance Council of Australia. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'll send you to speak up a little bit, please, Tom. We have Tanya Lehman, Associate Professor and Dean of Law at Flinders University in Adelaide. Welcome, Tanya.
Hello, Jerome, and hello, listeners.
And our next speaker, next panelist, Cecilia Warren, Director of Mobility Research and Development at IAG. Welcome, Cecilia.
Good morning.
And joining me in the studio here, Marcus Burke, Project Director, Compliance and Technology at the National Transport Commission. Welcome, Marcus.
Thanks, Jerome. Good morning.
So now, a bit of housekeeping for what we have ahead of you today. We're looking at having around 60 minutes. If we do have a lot of discussion, we might just extend it out for another 15 minutes, but it all depends on how things are flowing on the day. So we just hope you bear with us. The whole thing's going to be question engagement. Fire away when you're ready. Now, for those of you who join us on a webinar, what you have in front of you is a little question box. Please add your questions up there. We will see them and we'll be able to ask them as they go through. There may be different. Why can't we see our panelists? Well, if you were to see them, we'd have a few buffering issues, and so we sort of choose not to in that sense. So we'd prefer to have them operating and discussing in real time. Now, our 3 core questions we have today. What is the role of insurance in the future mixed fleet road network, where automated and human driven vehicles are interacting and negotiating each on the roads? Our second question, do today's insurers want to insure automated driving features, so level 3 to 5? And our third one is, what is the role of motor accident injury schemes in a mixed fleet environment? So we're going to be delving into them, and that's the basis of what we have today. So for those of you who don't know, insurers already provide insurance coverage for vehicles with automated features, including lane keep assist, self-parking, and autonomous braking, or AEB as it's commonly known. But as vehicles become increasingly automated and the human driver less involved in driving decisions, the traditional insurance model will be challenged, and insurers will find it necessary to reconsider their approach. So exciting times ahead in the insurance sector. Insurance plays a fundamental role underpinning the safety and security of Australian life, allowing people to engage in a degree of risk that they might otherwise find unacceptable. We know that without community acceptance of AVs, they will not succeed. And as Australia moves towards an automated automated vehicle,
Hello?
hello, Tom.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Okay, sorry, you just dropped out then. Thanks, Jerome. Insurance is key to supporting the adoption. Can you hear me all right, Jerome?
Tom, we can hear you perfectly well. Just speak up quite a bit louder, please.
Okay, I'll keep going. Sorry, Jerome. Thanks, Jerome. Insurance is key to supporting the adoption of AV technology, and insurers will continue to be involved in providing insurance as autonomous vehicles enter the fleet. As well as providing peace of mind and a safety net, insurance provides important risk signals. Where a risk is deemed too high, so will the price to insure that risk will also be high. In turn, this provides signals to manufacturers of autonomous vehicle technology to ensure safety and risk minimisation is a top priority, giving consumers an affordable option of adopting AV technology in vehicles. The AV world promises to substantially improve the safety of mobility. The entrance and take-up of autonomous vehicles in Australia has potential to substantially reduce road accidents and trauma caused by things like driver fatigue, driver error, and drink driving. However, a mixed fleet of vehicles will also mean a lot of the same risks that now exist will continue even once there is a wholesale adoption of level 5 autonomy. Damage to vehicles from things like hailstorms, falling trees and out of control trolleys and supermarket car parks will continue, of course. While the take-up of autonomous vehicles is expected to improve safety, malfunctions and accidents involving these vehicles may occur. Therefore, the need for property and injury insurance will continue. Property damage and injuries will continue, and so will the need for insurance. And while the look of mobility insurance will change as insurers assess risk and price based on the technology of the vehicle, rather than the human driving it, the feel of the insurance will be the same. We can see the private insurance market responding and catering for autonomous vehicles. However, there are challenges in relation to how autonomous vehicles will fit within statutory CTP insurance schemes. Thanks, Jerome.
Excellent. So now we've got some good scene setting. I think we'll dive on in. So our first sort of question. Does an automated vehicle world open the market to a flood of new insurers? Over to you, Marcus and Tom.
So from a government perspective, our focus is more on the motor accident injury insurance side of things, and the National Transport Commission is currently working in conjunction with state and territory insurance agencies to develop a discussion paper, which we're looking to have out in early October, setting out options for how automated vehicles might fit with current motor accident insurance schemes and then for reform. So we'll be looking at the views of what is the purpose of those schemes, what principles should guide our approach, and whether there is a need for reform. Part of the question we want to look at, part of the key issue is how do we ensure that a person injured in a crash with an automated vehicle is treated the same way and have equal access to compensation as someone who's injured in a crash with a human-driven vehicle. In terms of what all of that means for the market, I guess we're trying to be agnostic as to what that might mean for private insurers. We do recognise that there may be changes in the structure of the automotive industry and in the way that people own or access transport, but we need to develop policies that can cater to a range of different futures and a range of different deployment models.
Great, thanks for that, Marcus. So Tom, what's your thoughts? Now we've heard about it from the regulatory side, from the commercial side.
Well, in relation to there being a flood of new insurers, I'm not sure if that's the best terminology, but I can say that that insurers will be interested in underwriting this risk in time, and they're interested in doing it now. The same rationale for underwriting all risks is the same. It's all based on risk of accident. That's the underwriting basis that currently exists, and that will continue to exist for autonomous vehicles. And the insurance market in Australia is highly competitive, and where opportunities emerge, insurers will want to go in there if the risk is right. In terms of course, the framework in Australia is you must be a licensed insurer, and I think the regulatory setup, as discussed, will mean that insurers that want to get into this market will need to have the right prudential levels, be regulated by ASIC and APRA, and all those things that currently exist for existing insurance in the general insurance market in Australia.
Thanks for that, Tom. I guess one of the burning questions we're always going to be asking and seeing is talking about pricing of AV insurance products. What are some of the changes AVs will bring to the underwriters world, and what change will we need to ensure that the drivers factor in the risk factors as well? So, Cecilia, what's your thoughts?
Thanks, Jerome. Look, It's a really interesting question. So we need to look at essentially what the future holds. So what does the new technology actually bring, and then how do we respond? So if we look at it from the perspective of it is a new technology and we think back to the past, we know that when new technology emerges in transport, whether it be from trains or whether it be from cars coming onto the road in the first place, that insurance has created a response to those new technologies to help protect people where they've been injured. So for example, when trains were introduced in the UK, a product was created to cover for when someone was injured on that journey. That was in the 1850s. When when cars were introduced on the road here in Australia, we saw the introduction of compulsory third-party insurance schemes, and that was principally to respond to the risk of injury and death on the road, and also the risk of being sued or financial loss for anyone who was a driver. So what we know is that the insurance industry has got a huge history and a wealth of knowledge to be able to bring that to bear to what the future holds. And when it comes to thinking about pricing, we almost need to think less about pricing and more about new products and services.
That's a great point. So question here from Richard straight away. Will there be an independent review of the role and structure of CTP schemes? So I guess the whole pricing thing is going to change. And who will be doing this? What do you think, Marcus?
So that's part of the work that we are currently embarking on. So it's reviewing the existing compulsory third-party insurance schemes to see how vehicles driven by an automated driving system might fit in with those existing schemes and whether there is a need for reform. So we are working very closely with state and territory insurance agencies. One of the challenges we do have in Australia is that we do have different schemes in different states and territories. So some are public, some are private, some are fault-based, some are no fault. And there will likely need to be a degree of consistency of treatment as the companies developing these products will presumably be looking to deploy them nationally. So we are examining those issues. We are looking to go out for public consultation with a discussion paper in early October. So it would be great to have many of the organisations who are represented on the call on the webinar here today contributing to that and giving us their views. The key question for us really is change required? And if so, do vehicles driven by an automated driving system, do they form part of existing compulsory third-party insurance schemes? Should they be covered by those schemes? Or should they sit outside? And if so, should they be required to have some other form of insurance coverage? So we'll be publicly consulting on all those issues, and we're really keen to get a wide variety of views.
How will the complexity go with Australia being a federation in all the different states? Will that be a bit of a barrier to get through?
Not necessarily. We don't necessarily need complete uniformity in the approach around the country, but there does need to be a level of consistency to allow vehicles to operate across different jurisdictions as they do today, or for drivers to move around. So we do have existing approaches today to cover those scenarios, and we need to make sure that they are adequately covered in the future as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all the schemes have to be exactly the same.
Excellent. And we have lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and tease them in as we go through, so please bear with me. And next sort of question we're looking at is data is increasingly becoming a powerful tool in shaping society. Who will own this data? What's your thoughts, Tanya?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Jerome, because if we think about the sorts of data that could be generated here, it's the data around the operation of the vehicle, the data from the GPS, so the location and the route, the data about who's entering the vehicle, whether they've got their own mobile device with them that clocks in when they start the journey or clocks out, so that it enables potentially personal tracking. There's also data from all of the infrastructure as vehicles speak to each other and vehicles speak to road infrastructure. And so there's enormous amounts of data, all of which potentially might be owned by different people. So there might be data that is generated by the vehicles that might be owned by the vehicle manufacturer and which is being relayed directly back to the vehicle manufacturer. And of course, in a world now where we no longer have vehicle manufacturing in Australia, that data may be going to a manufacturer in another country. We might have data that is public data that is owned by infrastructure providers. We might have private data that is data relating to the people who are actually in the vehicles or using the vehicles. And again, who owns that data is going to be, you might have lots and lots of different answers to that question depending on what sort of data you're looking at. If I can just go back to an earlier, one of the earlier questions that you raised about whether this new automated vehicle world opens the market to a flood of new insurers, it does mean that if we think about this context of this enormous amount of data being generated, one of the key issues I think might also be insurance in the context of cybersecurity and potentially data breach and theft insurance, because those are going to be real questions. The data is going to be enormously important in determining how the vehicles operate, how public transport is managed, how traffic flow is managed within cities, and how people use those vehicles. So we want to make sure that the data is absolutely secure and that there are frameworks in place to consider losses that might be incurred when there is a breach or theft of that data.
Who will own the data?
Hi Jerome, it's Cecilia here. I might step in. I think in terms of data ownership, it's a really key question. So firstly, we need to think about two ends of the spectrum. One is around the individual and the other is around social good. So I think there's no one clear answer, but certainly there needs to be a framework that's considered that looks at privacy, looks at ethics, looks at the customer's role in owning their own data and the agency that gives to them. And it also needs to look at things like necessary use. So by necessary use, I mean, does it, how governments use data, how police use data, how insurers and manufacturers, so that we sort of think from the broad level towards social good and what the data sets that are generated mean in terms of the broad road infrastructure or transport infrastructure of the future. So if we know that roads today are a public good, we know that data in the future will have an element of that, as well as then individual ownership and control around your data and protection and things like the necessary use.
A great question here just from Richard, drawing on these sort of points. Do you see data and its sharing as being categorized into 1, open and broadcast data, or 2, closed peer-to-peer data, or even a 3, closed and personal to use? What's your thoughts, Martin?
So from a data privacy perspective, one of the key questions is what is personal information, because that's the trigger for privacy legislation, both at the federal level and the state and territory level. So that goes to the question of whether the data can actually reasonably identify an individual, and hence it's captured by the current legislation. We need to, in thinking through these issues, think about what data are currently captured by vehicles, as well as things like mobile devices that might be linked into vehicles, and how the current regulatory frameworks actually cover that existing data, to then look at what might be different about automated vehicles and whether there is a need for a different approach. So in addition to the work that we're doing on motor accident injury insurance, the NTC is also developing a discussion paper, which will be out in the next couple of weeks, looking at government connected and to cooperative ITS and automated vehicle data, to look at what are the potential risks created by new data that might be generated by these vehicles, and whether the appropriate protections that we have in place can continue. So we are trying to look at these issues, but in light of what is actually different about automated vehicles.
And what about you, Cecilia? I guess from a major insurer's point of view, how would you address that?
Look, I think the question from Richard raised some really interesting points to this conversation, because it really thinks about what can be new in this new world. So if we think about what happened when we saw trains start to align to a common timetable and the sort of introduction of Greenwich Mean Time, we essentially created new things out of that. So this notion that by connecting different data sets, you can create new services and new products, and you can have, for example, consistent timetables across a whole nation. That notion of peer-to-peer services and new business models or new ways of accessing mobility mean that the data is that really sort of core infrastructure, like I was saying before, much like the road. So, you know, from my perspective, it's really about looking at how do we enable necessary and fair use and appropriate use, as well as protect people's rights. And I think one of the points that Tanya raised earlier was around cyber risk and those sorts of things that will be there in the future. So we're talking about new infrastructure, we're talking about new models, and we're also talking about new risks that are entering into the system.
Jerome, can I just jump in there and say that that also means that we have to think really carefully about how we communicate to the public about the data that they might be providing and whether they understand how that data might be used. So if we think about people giving out data, even if that's anonymised or depersonalised, with the capacity these days to aggregate very large data sets and use significant computer power to mine that data, it is possible to put large data sets together in a way that has never existed before, picking up on Cecilia's point, and then draw dots, join the dots, if you like, to identify people with reasonable levels of particularity. So as we think about this new issue that is arising in relation to data, we also need to think about how we communicate both the possibilities and risks to those people who are going to be using the automated vehicles.
So Tom, what's your thoughts from an entire sector? Like you guys obviously have an umbrella that you can trust the good insurers. If we see a flood of other insurers coming in, is that a risk?
The risk, I don't think there's a lot of risk with insurers, because I have a lot of faith that the regulatory framework we have in Australia will mean that only, if I can term it, the right insurers will come into the market to cover these risks. And comes with that is good underwriting, appropriate prudential regulation capabilities and all those kind of things. So I think the industry in Australia, across the board generally, but insurance in particular, is highly regulated with a high level of competition. So new entrants can come in, and they will, and the market will seek to get as many new entrants as possible. But to play in the market, obviously, you've got to tick the certain boxes to make sure that when claims come in, you are able to pay them, and consumers and everyone in the market is appropriately protected by what they're purchasing, and the safety net remains.
Excellent. Thank you guys very much. Let's move on to our next question. When a human-driven vehicle and automated vehicle collide, how will insurers decide fault? So, Marcus, what's your thoughts?
Well, perhaps one for the insurers as well, but I think this obviously links to the previous question around data, and we need to think about the different purposes which data might be used, and one is to, from a government perspective, to demonstrate the safety of the vehicle and to provide information about crashes when they take place. So we are looking at some of those issues as part of determining what the safety assurance approach should be for automated vehicles. So what data needs to be captured, and in what circumstances it needs to be provided to say, a government regulator. We do know that there's work going on internationally to standardise what's known as event data recorders. So this is black boxes for vehicles. So that should assist in the future in providing greater standardisation around the data that is collected when crashes do occur. We do, again, have existing regimes in place around how liability is determined, and clear principles that have been developed over many, many years. So the question is, again, what's different about automated vehicles that could require a different approach?
Thanks.
Can
Cecilia.
I jump?
Sorry, go Tanya.
Sorry, I thought it might be useful if I jump in there and just talk about what those legal principles are that have been decided over many, many years in relation to determining fault, because they incorporate notions of taking reasonable precautions and reasonable precautions based on foresight of future risk. And so when we think about the vast amounts of data that automated vehicles automated vehicles could create, if we're thinking about assessing risk and foreseeing potential risks and then determining what precautions might be a reasonable response to those risks, we now also have to think about a new world where potentially we'll have vast amounts of data available in real time that will be able to identify risks in ways that haven't previously been able to be identified. So how does that impact on existing legal tests around foreseeability? And then thinking about reasonableness of precautions, when we think about what's reasonable, we're weighing things like the probability of the harm occurring, the likely seriousness of that harm, the burden of taking precautions, and any social utility. And again, I think that's going to present new challenges in this context of automated vehicles, with the amount of data that there will be about how these vehicles have operated wherever that they are in use around the world.
Good, Tanya. Cecilia, what's your thoughts?
So I think if we think about data, it's almost like the new witness, isn't it? So we're quite used to this notion of witness statements in collisions and trying to determine fault. So what we'll have now is essentially a real-time, immediate form of witness in the form of data. And they'll be in vehicles, they'll be in street infrastructure, it'll be sort of everywhere. And so what we can do is look at combining both what the human has said and also what the vehicle says and what the data indicates. That will pose some interesting challenges. I think there's things such as the quality of the data. So how accurate are the sensors and the passing of that data through the various sort of sensors and LiDAR systems, etc. There's also the question of accessibility of the data. So, you know, having oodles of data is great, but you still need to be able to access it, and there's a cost associated with that. But really it's about collaborating across government, industry, and even in the research community. Some of the work that we have underway at the moment is really
Yeah, Cecilia, I think we seem to have just lost you for a second. Hello? We seem to have just momentarily lost Cecilia. Tanya, are you still there?
Hello, Jerome. I am still here. This is Tanya speaking. I wonder whether I can add something more to Cecilia's comments.
I think you'd better. We're waiting for Cecilia to come back online.
And the interesting thing when we're thinking about fault from the point of view of a legal test is it's about standing in the shoes of the person involved, who's alleged to be the person causing the fault, immediately prior to the accident or the negligence occurring. And so it's about making hypothetical prospective assessments about what might be reasonable faced with a risk rather than looking backwards. And so I do think the availability of data is going to change the game around how assessing the risk that you should respond to will be made. Cecilia made a comment that it's going to be potentially very expensive to use the vast amounts of data or to analyse those amounts of data and do that in real time. And so that may be a factor that plays into whether or not it was a reasonable precaution to take to respond to risk. It's also going to be interesting to think about the sorts of allegations that are usually made about fault in motor vehicle accidents, and they're things like you failed to keep a proper lookout, you failed to drive at a proper speed, you failed to drive appropriately for the conditions, or you failed to maintain a safe distance. Now, all of those things might change when it's no longer humans determining what's a safe distance, but it's the vehicle driving systems.
Excellent, thank you for that. Well, we've got Cecilia just come back. She's dropped off for a second there. Cecilia, you still there?
Yes.
The joys of technology. It happens from time to time, people, so I do apologise. Cecilia, did you want to continue?
Yes, so I just heard the tail end of what Tanya was saying. I think, again, with this technology, if we think about sort of notions like safe distance, etc., you know, even that notion will change. So how close you can be to another driver will change once we've got technology that actually talks. So we've got what we call cooperative technology that talks from one vehicle to another. So we'll actually potentially be able to create not only more safety, but also more efficiency in the system.
Well, an interesting question here from Keith, which he's posing. And he goes, the fatal AV pedestrian crash in Temple, Arizona raises many questions about responsibility and liability. In a fully automated environment, who will the insurers see as being responsible when a fatal or serious injury crash occurs?
So I might also, it's Marcus here, chime in on this one. So part of the work that the National Transport Commission is doing is also looking at what the safety assurance approach should be for automated vehicles, and that includes looking at who are the parties responsible and what are their obligations. So we have done consultation over the course of this year, looking at what that safety approach should be and what companies need to demonstrate upfront in terms of the evidence that they can manage the safety risk. What we have proposed is a mandatory self-certification approach where companies will need to demonstrate evidence against a range of safety criteria, which include things like cybersecurity that we've touched on today. So I think part of the answer is we need to make it very clear who is the entity that's actually in control of the vehicle when it's operating in automated mode, and that they have appropriate responsibilities in place, which includes demonstrating that the vehicle is safe up front and responsibilities around monitoring the operation of the vehicle during its life.
And just a question from David, which is a good segue in. Do you think that the automotive companies will ensure the use of their technology, which the owner will inherit when purchasing a vehicle?
That's an interesting question. I think it does go to some of the questions around the business models and the ownership models. So will vehicles continue to be sold to private owners, or will the companies running these vehicles actually look to own them themselves and instead sell the service? So that's, I guess, yet to be determined, and it will likely be mixed. So we need to develop a policy approach that caters for these different futures and for a range of different business models and deployment models.
And a question here now. So will fault matter? And I've got a question here from Andrew as well to tease into it. What are the insurance implications if a fault in the automated vehicle technology results in a fatality? So will fault matter? Cecilia.
Great question. For this, I might look to the UK model. So the UK have actually introduced some legislation just in the last few months that tries to ensure that they've got a way of dealing with this sort of thing should an event happen in the UK. And what they've said is that they can't necessarily answer all the questions of the future, but they can take what we call a minimum viable product approach and say, what do we know from today, and how do we extend what we know today and make it fit for the next likely step tomorrow? And so what they've done is they've used the existing motor framework, that covers their personal injury and other liability policies. And they've said, if an event happens with an automated vehicle, then we're going to create what we call a claimable event. And that means that the event essentially creates or commences an insurance response to that. From the customer's point of view, which is really key to think about here, I think we kind of need to come back to less about insurers and less about manufacturers and less about other things, but more about what the customers actually need at this point. So for customers, it means they have a really simple model of accessing insurance. They know they just go to their insurer. For the insurer, they simply then work as they've done behind the scenes for thousands of years or hundreds of years, working with other parties to undertake recoveries as needed. So in that instance, there's sort of an existing or a body of ability to actually respond in those circumstances. But I might just call out something else, particularly as we're sort of talking about safety in the earlier questions. So the tail end of the question referred to a fatality. I think it's really important for us to think about how we both encourage innovation, but also keep a very high bar for safety, because we are talking about people's lives here. And what we've seen in the US in particular is potentially people being injured or killed by these vehicles without necessarily even signing up to being part of a trial or a concept around that vehicle. So we need to ensure that we both encourage innovation, but that we keep a high bar for safety. That means that over the long term, we'll actually be able to create trust and confidence for consumers, for people who will use this technology.
It's Tom here. I might just jump in there as well, because from an insurance perspective and beyond that, safety is absolute key for this technology. The industry supports it because the aim of it is it will create more safety. So if there's any question that there's incidents of not even just fatality numbers, but incidents where errors could result in fatalities, that is something that manufacturers be aware of and insurers will have to be aware of, and it will stop take-up of this technology. And I think manufacturers are fairly aware of that. So I was talking about this with someone the other day, and they mentioned that technology for there to be pilotless aircraft has been around for 30 years, yet no airline has ever adopted it. That sort of indicates that people don't want to adopt technology if they feel uncertain about something, even if it is, in all the data and everything indicates it is quite safe. So for there to be take-up, people have to really accept and believe that the technology is safe.
Can I jump in there too, Jerome? Because that point that Tom made, I think, is a really important one. That the data would suggest that when it comes to motor vehicle accidents, the most unsafe thing about any motor vehicle accident is the human who's driving that vehicle. And so I think it is important for us to think about ways that we can reduce the existing risk that's posed by human drivers who are distracted by their phones, who are looking around, who are not driving safely, are driving at excessive speeds, are driving under the influence. We need to do all that we can to encourage any adoption of technology that can reduce that risk that's posed by human drivers. I wanted to also suggest that the uptake of this new technology gives us a really unique opportunity to think about whether we do need to have a more uniform approach nationally to this issue about whether fault will matter or not. At the moment, when we're thinking about motor vehicle collisions, we have to respond to personal injuries, but we also have to respond to property damage. And whilst there might be different approaches to CTP schemes around Australia, there are also people who bring claims in relation to property damage, and usually those claims require the proof of fault by some other person. And so we need to factor that into the mix as well. And the UK approach doesn't talk about just personal injury, but damage. Could be personal injury, could be other sort of property damage. So we need to think really broadly about all the sorts of damage that might occur by the use of these vehicles and think about how we respond to that.
And just to follow up on that, Marcus here, that in terms of whether fault matters, it certainly does today in existing compulsory third-party insurance schemes. We have some schemes that are no fault in this country, but others that are fault-based. So that's very much a part of the existing regulation today.
I think, and this is a good question here from Ray. The problem with CTP insurance is, when does the liability shift from the driver to the manufacturer of the automatic systems? Does the recording system become a legal documentary?
So it will be very important that it's clear who is driving the vehicle at a particular point in time, whether that's a human driver or whether that's the automated driving system. the way the National Transport Commission approach this is that we've described a party called the Automated Driving System entity as the company that would be responsible for the automated driving system. We've used that term rather than manufacturer because it may not actually be the manufacturer of the vehicle. It could, for example, be a software provider, as we're seeing with some of the trials taking place internationally. But the company looking to bring the vehicle to market would take on the responsibility, and part of the data recording would need to ensure it's very clear whether a human driver or the automated driving system was in control of the vehicle at a particular point in time.
There's a question here from Russell asking, will there be a standard format for that?
Well, I mentioned earlier there is work going on internationally on standardisation of, in particular, event data recorders, which will record some of this information. The point I was just making around control at a particular point in time, which may not be when a crash occurs. That I'm not aware of a standard approach, but we do anticipate that will evolve internationally, and Australia will need to make sure that we align with international decisions there.
Thank you. So just moving along, how do people injured in that crash get early and straightforward access to treatments and rehabilitation? Tom, what's your thoughts?
Well, the short answer is through a effective and well-designed CTP scheme, which I think we have in most jurisdictions in Australia. That's the short answer. And the reason we have these is because it has been identified, going back several decades, that other forms of insurance, whether it be liability insurance or whatnot, don't adequately provide the level of treatment and rehab that is required, that people require if they're involved in a serious accident or even a minor accident. And we need a more tailored response in terms of a safety net and insurance safety net. Hence, we have the various CTP schemes across Australia.
Thanks. I've got a question from Edelin just saying, how will insurance premiums be impacted by the level of automation? Will we see that at all begin to impact?
So from a perspective, we haven't looked at that as yet. There's a few different variables there as to whether these the frequency with which these vehicles will crash, and we all anticipate and hope that they will be much safer and crash less frequently. But also the cost of those crashes. So the crashes could be rarer, but more significant when they do occur. So there's a few different variables, and the short answer is we don't know at this stage. And I'd be interested on the views from some of the insurers about what they're saying.
I think Cecilia's about to join us now. Cecilia, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, great. It's a great question. I think we need to think about a couple of things. So one, we have the promise of a huge impact to safety. But if you look at where the accidents and collisions occur, they're not necessarily all in the areas where this vehicle technology will be introduced first. So if you think about rural roads, you think about sort of regional areas, it's not necessarily going to be there that we sort of see the first benefit. We're also seeing a lot of the technology at the moment is very much low speed. So again, typically you're not sort of seeing a huge impact in terms of personal injury. And these are things that we actually really need to sort of create some uplift on. I think the other thing is people often think about this or this question or insurance in terms of what they see today with their personal experience. And it's a really legitimate sort of response that you think, well, I buy a car and then I need to go and get insurance for it. Well, you don't necessarily think about the insurance if you're in a sort of a package car or a lease car or a company car. You don't necessarily think about the insurance that sits behind buses that you're on, but all of those things are insured. So it may just be that the actual insurance component may become a little less visible to the consumer, or it may also be that we start to get different types of insurance or assurance products that can start to come to market, much like we saw when the trains were introduced for the first time, and people purchased an insurance policy that was a postcard along with their ticket for the ride.
Can I just jump in there, Jerome? I agree with the comments that Cecilia's made, and I think she's done that very well. I think from my perspective, I think it's really important that people who are injured in any form of motor vehicle accident involving a driverless vehicle are not any worse off because it was a driverless vehicle. And at the moment, as we've said already, we have a number of different schemes around the country, but we also have a product liability scheme under the Australian Consumer Law. And I can foresee that where there's uncertainty around that, or where there's difficulty accessing CTP schemes, there might be incentives for creative lawyers to look at other avenues. And I think that it's an opportunity, the adoption of this technology is an opportunity to make sure that we're not providing encouragement for people to pursue opportunities under, for example, product liability because there's a safety defect in a product rather than accessing CTP schemes. And I think there's been discussion amongst the Parliamentists at other times and in other venues about ensuring that there's a simple one-stop shop for consumers and for people who are injured, and then leaving it to insurers perhaps to negotiate how they might resolve some of those complexities behind that one-stop shop.
Right. I think a bit of a devil's advocate question here from David I really like. So, and he's sort of assuming that, I guess, AVs will improve safety. So as premiums decrease in the long term due to less injuries and the investment pool decreases as a result, will CTP insurers leave the market due to lack of investment returns? What's your thoughts, Cecilia?
Thanks, David. So again, it kind of comes back to some of the things that I was saying earlier. Insurers are in the game typically for the long haul, and we have been, as a company, we've been around for well over 100 years in Australia, and we'll continue to serve the Australian market. What we look at and what we're interested in is what are people's actual mobility needs, and how do we respond to any risks that they have in that, and beyond risk, how do we actually prevent risk, and then go into this sort of notion of creating safety. To do that, you need to start to add value to customers. And I think that the question comes less about sort of return on investment or pricing or those sorts of things, and more about what value can you provide to customers and how can you better respond and better enable their actual mobility needs. And that's something that we're really quite keen on looking at.
That's a good one, wasn't it? And another one just here from Andrew quickly. Are delays in insurance claims likely to increase due to infighting between technology owners and vehicle manufacturers? So how will you deal with that as an insurer? Cecilia.
Look, we deal with recoveries behind the scenes quite frequently. So there's a lot of expertise around that, and I think it's probably one of the things that the fact that consumers don't necessarily see it is a good thing, because really insurance should be quite simple and easy for people. It shouldn't have to be involving courts and complex claims processes. It should just be something that is an easy experience for people. So I think insurers have been doing recoveries and working through these sorts of things for a long time with multiple parties. In fact, CTP schemes currently do it today. So it's various bodies, from government to manufacturers to local councils to road users, all sorts of parties who are at fault. So it's not really anything new. It would just be applied in a new way.
Fantastic. I think that'll make people feel a little bit at ease. So just looking at the next question we have, what will it take for Australia to reach a harmonisation of CTP schemes so that across the country people are supported in a consistent way when they are injured in an accident involving an automated vehicle? Tom, would you like to start?
Well, fundamentally, it would take a lot of cooperation by the various states wanting to commit to having a unified, harmonised scheme. That's sort of the long and short of it, really. There's multiple schemes in Australia, each quite different, each offering different benefits. I think the insurance industry generally supports the idea of a level of harmonisation, but obviously there's political challenges with that.
And Jerome, I might just add to what Tom has said. We've been arguing for a number of years that you could actually look at what we have in this sort of federated model with CTP and follow something that we've already done with the National Injury Insurance Scheme. And what we did there was we created harmonisation across the cover for people who were injured in a catastrophic way. So where previously, 10 years ago, there was different levels of cover for catastrophic injury around the country. Now what we have is a consistent level of cover, but still operated at the local state level. So we did that through an agreement. All states agreed through the COAG process that they would create a level of harmonisation, and that the harmonisation was around the cover, so it was a minimum benchmark approach. It wasn't around the schemes themselves. And I think that's a really important point to consider here, that we don't need to completely overhaul and change everything. What we need to do is take the next best step to ensure that we've got consistent cover across the nation, and that we allow the learnings and insights from these vehicles, including the trials that we have underway in Australia at the moment. So we enable our schemes to start to respond to those. So we don't sort of create different sort of ways that people will experience insurance and recovery when they need to. We need to keep a level of consistency, a level of product cover, but we don't need to dismantle what we've got, and we can still enable states to have their private underwritten schemes as well as their public underwritten schemes. We don't need to kind of unpack that.
Oh, I like that. So Marcus, you got to be having a burning thought on this one.
Well, I think that point around the approach for catastrophic injury is certainly an approach we need to consider for insurance for automated vehicles, so that there may be national agreement to minimum benchmarks, but states and territories implement them in their own way and within their own scheme. So that's certainly an option that we will be considering as part of the discussion paper that we'll be putting out in the coming weeks. The other point I'll probably just make in terms of harmonisation is that the approach to all of this could change over time. So the approach that you need on day one, when you've got just a handful of automated vehicles operating in very limited circumstances, might be different to what you need in 10 years' time, when they make up a much more significant part of the fleet and operate much more broadly. So we also need to think about how schemes might need to evolve over time, and that there might be more minimal changes in the short term, but potentially build into more significant changes in the longer term.
Thanks, Marcus. And just a question from David just shot in. For CTP schemes designed no fault, may these be appropriate across the country? Can you comment? So we'd like to touch on that.
So as part of the work that we're doing is we're looking at how if automated vehicles came in today, how they would be considered by existing compulsory third-party insurance schemes if there was a crash. And our initial analysis is that some schemes, particularly the no-fault ones, would capture crashes caused by an automated vehicle, but other schemes wouldn't, or it would be quite uncertain given the different definitions and thresholds set within the legislation. So they would currently likely be covered in different ways around the country.
Thanks, Marcus.
Can I jump in there, Jerome, and say that those eligibility thresholds currently rely on definitions of motor vehicle accident or transport accident or drive or driving, and so there's not even a consistent approach to eligibility for schemes around the country. Some of those eligibility criteria just won't be relevant when we have an automated vehicle, but we also need to think about when an issue might be caused not by something that happens in the vehicle, but by something happens externally to it. Say there's a breakdown in the infrastructure, or for whatever reason a traffic light is not connected to the system and so the vehicle can't communicate with it. If something like that happens, then those eligibility criteria would suggest that this is probably not then an accident caused by a motor vehicle, and so we need to think carefully about how those threshold eligibility criteria are constructed so that they might take account for the new types of ways that these vehicle accidents might occur.
Thanks for that, Tanya. We are probably just going to run a little bit over, so I do apologise because we've got so many questions coming in. I'll just move on to the next one. How can Australians be sure that they will get the claims assistance they will need when much of the liability may fall to international organisations? So, Cecilia, would you like to start?
Great question. I think something that Tom alluded to earlier in the webinar is that there is a really strong prudential requirement and framework for insurance as it operates in Australia. And what that means is that people or insurers are required to hold a significant amount of capital in Australia to ensure that claims can be paid. This applies in terms of motor, sort of typical motor compensation, but also third party for the bodily injury. Now that is needed to be held in quite a substantial way, and I believe that there is that same framework would need to be applied to a manufacturer or any other party if they were to try to be an insurer in Australia. I think the more important point is around how insurers and manufacturers and other parties collaborate to ensure that there are appropriate arrangements, because the last thing you want is for a consumer to have to make a claim against an international company or to go to court. So we have an existing and robust and sustainable industry here in Australia. We have a huge requirement about the capital that's required to be held. We need to remember that some of these incidents, so if an injury occurs, it can take up to 4 years before someone's covered. So that means that the insurer has to be there for the life of that claim, which is a long-term claim.
I hadn't thought of it that way, I must admit. A question here from Mick, just sort of drawing on that. Will there be any change in liability for road authorities associated with the quality of road assets provided for use by autonomous vehicles? I think that's a pretty interesting point, that one, Mark.
I'll address that. I might just the previous question
as well.
Some of the work that we did earlier in the year looking at the safety assurance process and proposing that there is this new party called the Automated Driving Entity, the party that's the technology to market. One of the requirements we proposed is that that party has a corporate presence in Australia and that there's minimum requirements to ensure that they're meeting claims required. So I'm through some of those issues and ensure that the framework actually supports that. In terms of the level of liability of road agencies for infrastructure, we did have a look at this as part of some earlier work. Currently, there are different approaches in different states and legislative limitations have been put in place on road agency liability for issues that could be caused today. So, with a pothole in a road that might cause a crash. So, we haven't proposed any changes to that at this point. But most jurisdictions, states and territories do limit their liability in different ways.
Can I just make a very quick comment on that, Jerome, that when we're thinking about the liability of road authorities, we have to think about who they might owe a duty of care to and just how far that might extend, what precautions are reasonable for them to take, and whether or not the thing that it is alleged that they have not done, that their negligence has in fact caused the damage that the injured person is complaining of. And the success of injured persons in terms of bringing claims against road authorities is very mixed here in Australia, and they are usually very complex claims, because it's important for us to think about if we've got a public provider of infrastructure or even a private provider, just how far are we going to impose liability on them? Is that a duty to the whole world or not? Those are very complex legal questions.
Mm. And just a quick question here from Keith before we move on to the next one, the final question. The insurers can do much to pull levers for safety and have been lacking in this area. Drunk drivers are uninsured. Why are drivers who deselect safety features continue to be covered out of a pool of safety drivers or owners are funding? It's a really interesting posed question. What happens if you turn the technology off? Does the insurance still remain?
Can I just respond to that question very quickly? I'm not sure that it's entirely true to say that drunk drivers are not insured. I think the way that works now is that there are deductions made in terms of liability, particularly where a drunk driver is the person who themselves is injured. And I can imagine that it would be possible for the law to deal with people using the vehicles turning off the safety equipment in a similar way by imposing discounts on whatever compensation they might be entitled to on the basis of contributory negligence.
Cecilia and Tom, what's your thoughts from an industry perspective?
So just a quick note, Tom's had to leave. He's got to take a flight to Melbourne, but I think I agree with Tanya that the mechanism exists today to provide disincentives or incentives for people to not behave badly. Sorry, I've just given a double negative. I think it's the it's a Friday afternoon. But really, I think if you think about what's possible in the future and the ways we can think about how technology can help to create safety, so prevent some of these things, we'll start to see things that, you know, cameras that can start to detect fatigue before someone falls into a microsleep. You know, and assistance systems inside the vehicle that can help with highway driving. So we'll start to see, I think, an introduction over time, much like we have with seatbelts and autonomous emergency braking, etc. And these features will all start to build towards a safer future, and that's what's so exciting about this space.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to our final questions, and we'll see how we go for another couple of minutes. What can insurers do today to support automated vehicle trials and make Australia an attractive place for manufacturers to send their vehicles and technology? Cecilia, would you like to start?
I would. So two things. One, we can help to underwrite the trials, which is happening at the moment. But two, where there are barriers to insurance, we can be speaking out about those. So that's a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. And where we see the biggest barrier is around CTP insurance. And simply put, CTP is actually the single biggest barrier to anyone underwriting a trial or conducting a trial at the moment, because while the states have all enabled trials to be on the road, they haven't yet adjusted their CTP schemes to respond. And they're things that the state governments can all be doing. I think the other piece that we can be doing, and it's work that we are undertaking as ING, is looking at how we communicate and collaborate with the research community and with the people who are actually pushing ahead in this space. So we then work with them to say, well, how do we start to understand the new types of risks that are coming and the new ways and things that are going on, so that, in a sense, we're actually prepared when the vehicles hit the road in a more mainstream way.
Marcus, would you like to build on Cecilia's answer?
Sure. So the National Transport Commission developed guidelines for automated vehicle trials, which have been adopted nationally, and they do reference insurance requirements and make it clear that there needs to be appropriate insurance in place for the trial based on the scope of the trial, but it isn't prescriptive about what form that insurance takes. We are aware that there are different approaches being taken for trials in different states and territories as to whether trials should be covered by compulsory third-party insurance. So we see that some of the work that we're doing looking at the longer-term solution should hopefully help inform that approach to trials. And we are reviewing our current, or we will be reviewing current trial guidelines starting in the next 12 months. So that may be an opportunity to look at some of these insurance issues for trials as well.
So Tanya, from a legal perspective, how valuable are they and for the insurance sector to do these sort of things?
I think it's really valuable. One of the things that we're doing with our trial here on our Flinders University campus is getting data from users of the vehicles about how they perceive the risk and what concerns them about using the vehicle and what would make them even keener to use those vehicles. And I know that similar research has been undertaken in Western Australia with the vehicle that they've been trialling there, and I'm sure is happening at the other trials in Australia as well. And I think having insurers partner with researchers to not only understand what the community thinks about using the vehicles, but to assure the community that they will be adequately protected will be really important in encouraging people to adopt this new technology.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I know we've sort of come to the end of our webinar today. I do apologise for some of the technical issues. I just want to say thank you very much to our panellists for giving us their time, and especially thank you very much to our listeners. So thank you, Marcus.
Thanks, Jerome.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you.
And thank you, Tanya. I hope you've enjoyed some of the insights. And I hope you've had a bit of a discovery around insurance around the ADVI world, and how they're desperately trying to lead the way in moving our world forward into the new mobility sector. We have a new webinar scheduled for the 12th of October, and this is really the last one in this series, looking at the barriers, which will then sort of feed into the summit, which happens the following week in Adelaide. So thank you very much for being part of it, and I hope you can join us again in the future.
Thanks, team.